"Excuse me, but I don't think you belong here." The words cut through the air like a blade, laced with arrogance and disdain. Victoria Sterling, a wealthy socialite draped in designer fashion, barely glanced up from her wine glass as she addressed the young waitress standing before her. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in town, a place where reservations were booked months in advance, where the elite gathered to indulge in overpriced delicacies. Tonight, Victoria was here with her usual circle, other high society women who thrived on gossip and condescension. Their laughter filled the space, but the moment Victoria laid eyes on the waitress, her expression shifted to one of immediate disapproval. The young woman standing before her, Maya, held her notepad with steady hands, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had dealt with all kinds of customers before, rude ones, entitled ones, the kind that snapped their fingers and never made eye contact. But there was something different about Victoria. The way her sharp blue eyes raked over Maya's dark skin, the way she curled her lips in disgust, made it clear this wasn't about bad service. It was about something deeper, something uglier. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I do work here," Maya said, her voice calm yet firm. She had been taught to remain professional no matter the situation, but inside, her patience was wearing thin. She had seen women like Victoria before, those who believed their wealth made them superior, who carried themselves as if the world belonged to them. And if Victoria was expecting Maya to shrink under her gaze, she was mistaken. Victoria scoffed, setting her wine glass down with an exaggerated sigh. "You must be mistaken. A place like this wouldn't hire just anyone. Are you sure you're not lost?" She smirked, her friends chuckling along, enjoying the spectacle. Maya took a slow breath, reminding herself not to react. "Would you like to hear tonight's specials?" she asked instead, keeping her voice neutral. Victoria leaned back in her chair, clearly entertained by the power she believed she held. "No, I'd like to speak to the manager. I can't imagine they'd allow this." She gestured at Maya. "To be part of the staff here. I mean, come on, darling. There are certain standards, aren't there?" Her friends erupted into laughter, their manicured hands covering their mouths in full modesty. A tense silence settled over the restaurant as other patrons began to notice what was happening. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended not to hear, afraid to get involved. The manager, a middle-aged man with graying hair, rushed over, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Victoria and Maya. "Yes," Victoria said, her tone dripping with irritation. "I don't know how someone like her got hired here, but it's unacceptable. I come here to enjoy fine dining, not to be served by people who don't belong in places like this." The manager's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Maya placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's fine," she said, then turned back to Victoria with a knowing look. "I understand exactly what kind of person you are." Victoria raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh, do you now? And what kind of person is that?" Maya smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The kind that underestimates people like me. The kind that believes wealth and privilege make them untouchable. But tell me something, Mrs. Sterling. Do you always insult people before knowing who they really are?" Victoria let out a sharp laugh. "And who exactly are you? Some struggling college student trying to make ends meet? A charity case?" Maya's expression didn't falter. She simply reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a sleek, black business card, flipping it between her fingers before placing it on the table. Victoria glanced at it lazily, until she saw the name printed in bold letters. Suddenly, her smirk disappeared. Maya Sullivan, CEO of Sullivan Enterprises. The blood drained from Victoria's face as she snatched up the card, her hands trembling slightly. The name was familiar, too familiar. Sullivan Enterprises was one of the fastest-growing companies in the country, known for its investments in real estate, technology, and philanthropy. It was a name whispered in elite circles, a name associated with power and success. And now, Victoria was realizing with dawning horror that the waitress she had just humiliated wasn't just a random server. She was the woman behind it all. The restaurant had fallen completely silent. The other patrons, the waitstaff, even Victoria's friends, all of them were watching, waiting. Maya leaned in slightly, her voice soft but firm. You see, Mrs. Sterling, I don't work here because I have to. I own this restaurant." Victoria's breath hitched. She looked around frantically, as if hoping someone would tell her this was a joke. But the look on Maya's face told her otherwise. You own this place?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded. "Among other things. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because people like you never bother to look past the surface. You assume that because of the color of my skin, because of the position I'm in at this moment, I must be beneath you." She straightened, crossing her arms. "Tell me, Mrs. Sterling, how does it feel to realize that the woman you just tried to degrade is the same one who could buy and sell everything you own without batting an eye?" Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her face was frozen in sheer terror, her mind scrambling for a way to salvage the situation. Her friends sat in stunned silence, their previous laughter now a distant memory. Maya didn't wait for an answer. She turned to the manager. "Please make sure that Mrs. Sterling and her guests are taken care of. But from now on, she won't be welcome here." Victoria gasped. "You can't be serious. You can't just ban me from—" Maya held up a hand, cutting her off. "I can, and I just did." She smiled, but there was steel behind it. "Enjoy your evening, Mrs. Sterling." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Victoria sitting there, paralyzed by the weight of her own actions. The humiliation, the shame, the realization that she had just insulted one of the most powerful women in the city. All of it came crashing down at once. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling, the woman who had always believed herself untouchable, felt truly, utterly powerless. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, the blood in her veins turning ice cold. Her hands trembled as she clenched Maya's business card between her fingers, the sleek texture a cruel reminder of her mistake. The once lively chatter of the restaurant had faded into a deafening silence. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her, judging her, condemning her. She had built her life on the illusion of superiority, on the belief that wealth and privilege made her untouchable. But now, she was the one being looked down upon, and for the first time, she understood what it felt like to be on the other side. Her friends, who had moments ago laughed along with her cruel jokes, now avoided her gaze. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly disinterested in the dinner they had been so eager to enjoy. None of them spoke. None of them defended her, because in that moment they all knew Victoria Sterling had just made a mistake she couldn't erase. She forced herself to take a slow breath, trying to regain her composure. This wasn't over. It couldn't be over. There had to be a way to turn this around. She turned toward the manager, her voice strained but still laced with entitlement. "You can't actually ban me. Do you have any idea who I am?" The manager, who had once groveled at her feet for her business, now stood tall beside Maya, his loyalty no longer in question. "I do, Mrs. Sterling," he said evenly. "And I also know that we have a strict policy against discrimination in this establishment." "Miss Sullivan," he emphasized her name, making sure Victoria fully grasped the weight of it, "has every right to refuse service to anyone who disrespects her staff. And as the owner of this restaurant, her word is final." Victoria's breath came in short, shallow bursts. She had never been humiliated like this before. Never in her life had she been made to feel so insignificant. Maya, standing with effortless confidence, studied Victoria for a long moment before shaking her head slightly. "You know what's funny?" she said, her voice quiet but firm. "People like you always assume power belongs to you, that you own every space you walk into, that you get to decide who matters and who doesn't. But the truth is, your power is built on nothing but privilege and arrogance, and privilege can be taken away in an instant." Victoria's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice rising slightly, desperation creeping into her tone. "You're overreacting. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding." Maya's lips curled into a half-smile. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. "You looked me in the eyes and told me I didn't belong here. You tried to have me removed from my own restaurant. And now that you realize who I am, you want to call it a misunderstanding." Victoria swallowed hard. She could feel the judgmental stares of the other diners, the whispering that had begun to spread through the restaurant like wildfire. She had never felt so exposed, so completely and utterly powerless. A part of her wanted to storm out, to leave this place, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part, the part of her that still clung to the illusion of control, refused to accept defeat. She took a deep breath, forcing her lips into a tight, forced smile. "Look, Maya," she said, her voice suddenly softer, almost conciliatory. "I didn't know who you were. If I had—" Maya cut her off with a sharp laugh. "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me with respect. But because you thought I was just another waitress, you felt comfortable treating me like garbage. That tells me everything I need to know about you." Victoria's jaw tightened, her carefully crafted mask beginning to crack. "I was just having a bad day," she said quickly, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. "You have to understand, people like me." Maya's expression darkened. "People like you?" she repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "People like you have spent centuries deciding who is worthy and who isn't. People like you have used power, wealth, and status to push people like me down, to keep us in our place. And now that the tables are turning, you don't know how to handle it." Victoria felt a rush of heat crawl up her neck. "That's not fair," she snapped. "I'm not some racist monster. I give to charities. I have black friends. Maya held up a hand, cutting off her desperate excuses. "This isn't about what you claim to support when people are watching," she said. "It's about how you act when you think no one important is paying attention. And tonight, you showed exactly who you are." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed again. There was nothing left to say. She had lost. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. And then, Maya took a step back and turned toward the manager. "Make sure her bill is covered," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We wouldn't want Mrs. Sterling to feel like she didn't get her money's worth tonight." The implication was clear. Victoria Sterling's money meant nothing here. The manager nodded, while Victoria's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had seen her humiliate countless people before, had laughed along as she belittled waiters, cashiers, and hotel staff. But now, she was the one on the receiving end, and not one of them dared to come to her defense. Feeling the walls closing in, Victoria did the only thing she could. She stood abruptly, snatching her purse off the table. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the exit, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the polished floor. The moment she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her like a slap. She felt dizzy, disoriented. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed a number. "Hello," came the familiar voice of her husband, Richard Sterling, a powerful real estate mogul. "Richard," she breathed, her voice unsteady. "You won't believe what just happened to me." She expected sympathy, outrage on her behalf, but instead there was a long pause. Then Richard sighed heavily. "I already know, Victoria," he said. "It's all over social media." Her blood turned to ice. "What?" she whispered. "I just got off a call with one of my business partners," Richard continued, his voice tense. "Maya Sullivan is not just some restaurant owner. She's one of the biggest investors in this city. And thanks to you, she's pulling out of multiple deals, including mine." Victoria's heart stopped. "You just cost us millions, Victoria," Richard said, his voice low and furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Terror clawed at her throat. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was about survival. I can fix this," she stammered. "I'll apologize, Richard cut her off. "No, Victoria. You've done enough." And with that, he hung up. Victoria stood there, her phone still pressed to her ear, the realization washing over her like a tidal wave. She had spent her whole life believing she was untouchable. But tonight, she had learned the truth. The world was changing, and for the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling was on the wrong side of it. Victoria stood outside the restaurant, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she clutched her phone. The night air felt heavier now, pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. Her entire world had just flipped upside down in a matter of minutes. Her husband, her powerful, well-connected husband, had turned his back on her. Her so-called friends had abandoned her the moment things got uncomfortable. And now she was alone. Alone, humiliated, and, worst of all, powerless. She could feel the stares of the other diners from inside the restaurant, their eyes burning into her back. Her carefully curated reputation, the one she had spent years crafting, was crumbling before her very eyes. Her breathing quickened. No, this couldn't be happening. She had always been in control. Always. She was Victoria Sterling. She didn't grovel. She didn't apologize. People bowed to her, not the other way around. But tonight, she had been reduced to nothing more than a pariah. She turned on her heels and hurried toward her sleek black car, fumbling with the keys as she tried to get inside as quickly as possible. Her hands shook too much to press the button. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath, struggling to compose herself. The streetlights above cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on her face, illuminating the raw panic in her eyes. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her stomach churn. A group of young people across the street, phones out, whispering, giggling. They were filming her. Filming her. A fresh wave of humiliation crashed over her. She could already imagine the headlines. Rich socialite gets publicly shamed by black businesswoman. The story would spread like wildfire. The comments would be merciless. The internet would rip her to shreds. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Her vision blurred as she finally managed to unlock the car. She slid into the driver's seat, her breath coming in quick gasps. Her head was spinning. She needed to think, needed to figure out a way to fix this before it got worse. Her phone buzzed beside her. A notification from Twitter. Then another. And another. She hesitated before clicking on the first one. It was already trending. Victoria Sterling exposed. Hundreds of comments, thousands of retweets. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the responses. Finally, someone put that woman in her place. "I've worked at one of her events before. She treats staff like garbage. Maya Sullivan is a queen. She handled this perfectly." What did she expect? White privilege doesn't work everywhere. Hope she loses everything. Her breath caught in her throat. She clicked on another post, this one from a well-known black activist with millions of followers. Victoria Sterling has built her life on stepping over people she considers beneath her. But tonight, she learned that the world is changing, that power is shifting, and that she is no longer untouchable. Let this be a lesson to every person who thinks wealth makes them better than others. Your arrogance will be your downfall. Her stomach twisted violently. She scrolled further, her panic growing with each new post. News outlets were picking it up now. Celebrities were weighing in. Even brands, ones she had worked with in the past, were issuing vague statements about standing against discrimination. Everything was spiraling out of control. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call. Her assistant. Victoria hesitated before answering. "What?" she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, finally, a small, hesitant voice. "Mrs. Sterling, I don't know how to say this, but the company is distancing itself from you." Victoria's heart stopped. "What? I just got a call from the board. They're releasing a statement in the morning. They're asking you to step down." The words hit her like a freight train. "They can't do that," she whispered. Another pause. Then softer. "They already did." The line went dead. Victoria felt like she had been punched in the gut. Her entire career, her legacy, was gone. Just like that. She dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, staring at it in disbelief. How had this happened? How had everything unraveled so quickly? Her thoughts raced as she tried to grasp at any remaining thread of control. She could fix this. She had to. Maybe she could do an apology interview. Maybe she could donate to some organizations, do a public service campaign, something. Anything to salvage what was left of her reputation. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't going away. This wasn't something money could fix. She had built her life on the illusion of power, on the belief that her privilege made her invincible. But tonight, The world had reminded her of a harsh reality. Power wasn't just about wealth. It was about influence. And right now, the influence was no longer in her hands. Her fingers clenched into fists. She had spent years looking down on people like Maya Sullivan, believing they didn't belong in her world, believing they would never rise high enough to touch her. But tonight, Maya hadn't just touched her. She had destroyed her. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Sterling had to face the one thing she had always avoided: consequences.